Good evening, everyone. I'm Josh Walt, professor of the practice in the Brandeis Journalism Program, and I'd like to welcome you all to the second part of our Elaine Wong Distinguished Lecture Program. It's great to see so many of students, campus colleagues, and media friends here tonight to engage in these critical and timely issues. Before the break, we were treated to a fascinating discussion about media in this age of polarization with our guest of honor, Dean Baquet, the Pulitzer Prize winning former executive editor of the New York Times. Now we'll build on this discussion, exploring how the media might evolve to spread truth and trust in a world where citizens increasingly pick the facts they want to believe and often vilify truth tellers who report what they don't want to hear. Tonight, Professor Neil Swidey, director of our growing journalism program, will welcome back Dean to continue the conversation, and they're joined by historian Gary Gerstle and sociologist Sarah Soberai to add critical context to help get to the roots of this complicated topic. Before we get started, we'll hear a few words of welcome from Jeffrey Shulson, our Dean of Arts and Sciences. Jeffrey is also a professor of English and a scholar of early modern literature and culture. Before joining Brandeis in 2023, he served as senior vice provost at the University of Connecticut. What he may have lost in March Madness excitement on that campus, he has gained in so many other ways as he leads our vibrant and ever-curious faculty and student body, inspiring them to tackle such thorny and imperative issues as we consider tonight. Welcome, Jeffrey.
Thanks, John. I'm still rooting for the Lady Huskies. So it's really great to see such a nice group of folks here. Welcome back for those of you who were here for the earlier session, and welcome anew for those of you who are just joining us for this second session. And it's terrific to see not just students, but so many notable journalists in the audience who've come to campus to join us for this event. I do want to take a moment just to recognize my colleague Elaine Wong, after whom this whole lecture series has been named. I unfortunately never had the privilege of working directly with Elaine because I got here after Elaine had already retired, but her legacy remains very, very powerful at the institution. And all of the colleagues that I have here who have worked with Elaine still think very, very highly and fondly of her and remember the kind of impact that she has had, which continues to last. So we're grateful to Elaine for being here and also for the legacy that she's left us here at Brandeis. That's okay, we can applaud. So as you just heard, we heard in our first panel, we heard some really interesting insights about the urgent demands that are facing journalism. I think that was set off by the very important and powerful introduction that President Levine gave at the outset of that session, and how urgently we need strong journalism in this country now more than ever. And some of the implications that these demands have on the growing challenges to our democracy. And this second panel will, I think, delve a little further into some of the dynamics of the polarization that we're experiencing now, and what, if anything, we can do about that. So joining Dean Baquet on the podium, or right here on these chairs, are our two distinguished scholars, historian Gary Gerstle and sociologist Sarah Soberai. You'll hear a little bit more about them from Neil when he comes up to moderate this panel. I just also want to mention how this event is a prime example of what we're really trying to lean into here at Brandeis, which is the kinds of connections and cross-disciplinary pollinations that can happen when departments work together, programs work together. This is an event that was mounted not just by the journalism program, but also in collaboration with the departments of sociology, politics, and the program in international and global studies. We want to do more of that. We think that our education at Brandeis should not be limited or constrained by the different departments and their in siloed ways, but that we're stronger when we work together. And this is a perfect example of that. And I'm grateful to Neil and his team in journalism, but also for my colleagues in those other programs for working so well together to put this really, really impressive program before you. I don't think that we can promise any easy answers this evening to the challenging questions we're about to talk through. But I'm looking forward to the discussion, and I'm also looking forward to your terrific questions as I heard them in the earlier session as well. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Neil.
We're going to build on that conversation we had earlier today with the discussions with Dean and Gary and Sarah. And we've been wrestling with these issues as they've been happening in the last week, how to make sense of what's happening all around us. And I think we've got an amazing group of people here to do this. You know already if you were here earlier, but just for those of you who weren't here, Dean Baquet was the longtime executive editor of the New York Times, Pulitzer Prize winning reporter from the Chicago Tribune, and an amazing and beloved editor at the Times. Now he's doing something really important that gets right to this issue of polarization, and something we talked about in the first panel, and that is the local news deserts around the country. His problem is just a drop in the bucket, his approach, I'm sorry for that, but it does get at it's really telling that Dean chose in his semi-retirement or step down towards retirement to take on this huge task, working with reporters and news organizations around the country to do that. Gary Gerstle is an emeritus professor at the University of Cambridge. His book, The Rise and Fall of the Neoliberal Order, is amazing. If you haven't read it, I really urge you to read it. It puts into context so many of the issues that we're all wrestling with in the best way that journalism does about, and history does, in pulling the threads of important issues that we might have missed at the time, and giving us a sense of how to make sense of those now. Gary is from the States, but lived for a decade in the UK, and just moved back last summer or fall. He's a fellow right now at the Harvard Radcliffe Institute, and he moved his belongings in the opposite direction of a lot of people in higher ed right now. But we're grateful that he's here and closer by, and I'm sure you're going to really draw from his interesting insights about this. Sarah Soberai is the professor of sociology at Tufts. She, with Jeffrey Berry, was the co-author of a really remarkable book that was prescient in many ways in 2013, The Outrage Industry, that really tracked something important that was happening in the media. And that was this move toward mediated guides to the news. In this case, at the time, they were looking at cable news, and the idea that people wanted their news not from institutions, but from somebody who would explain the news to me. I like the way Sean Hannity explains the news to me, or I like the way Rachel Maddow explains the news to me. And I think it's really important to know that that phenomena happens on both sides of the ideological spectrum. And then she built on that with a really perceptive book called Credible Threat that I think grew out of your research on that first book about what is happening with particularly women online as we've moved to an all digital media world. And that's interestingly the world that Dean presided over at the New York Times, moving the Times from what was a print institution to an all digital institution with 11 million subscribers and from all over the world. But it changed in some ways what everyone was doing, and all of us in the media, to grapple with this idea of how you make sense of the world when people want someone to tell them what's actually happening and what they trust. And that has challenged all of us in journalism. I think any of us who grew up in newsrooms where the institution was more important than any one person in it, we've had to grapple with the idea that the audience wants something different. And in this past election, we saw it not so much with cable TV, but with podcasts, right? People wanting someone else to explain something to them. They build their knowledge based on the work that institutional journalists are still doing, but they do it in a different way. And I think we need to grapple with that, because that's at the core of this issue right now of the news that we're getting. So we're going to start. This panel is a little different because we're trying to give everyone a grounding on where we come into this with. And some of you have read Gary and Sarah's work. Our students certainly have read parts of their work that they've been preparing for these panels for a while now. But for those of you who haven't, who want just sort of a grounding on what we do, we've asked Gary and Sarah to start with 5 minutes each to kind of give us a primer on what we need to do, and then we'll really dive into the question from there, and then we'll move it to questions from all of you. So we'll start with Gary, and again, my thanks for bringing your own copies. Gary, I was thinking, our move in the last decade to a fully digital media environment has coincided with the rise in hyperpolarization, but many of the seeds of our current media landscape were planted much earlier. Could you give us a primer on some of those important earlier forces? In particular, the erosion of the country's longstanding regulation of public airwaves beginning in the 1980s, and then in the 1990s, what was happening behind the scenes when the mainstream media was fixating on the left versus right culture wars?
Thank you, Neil. Thank you, fellow panelists. Thank you, audience, for coming out for the second barrel of this evening, even though it's dark outside. And thank you, Dean, for a wonderful session earlier this afternoon. It's a privilege to be at Brandeis. I've not been here in quite some time. I just want to say in regard to Brandeis, used to write a lot of constitutional history, and the greatest jurist for me was Louis Brandeis. So I'm really honored to be on his ground and to share that ground with you. Neil's been really strict about the 5-minute rule, and so I guess since this is journalism, you get a series of headlines or leads. And I want to focus on a moment in the 1990s when a very important reform was enacted called the Telecommunications Reform Act of 1995 that I knew nothing about in the 1990s, even though I was already a grown man at that time, because at the time we were all fixated on the culture wars and the division between left and right. And the two, you could have a different set of arguments about which sets of people hate each other the most. But let me give you one set. Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich hated each other's guts with every fiber of their being. Clinton was depicted as the flower child of the 60s, the draft dodger, the marijuana smoker, but he didn't inhale. Irresponsible in office, in public and private life. And Newt Gingrich, whose personal life was actually a lot messier than Clinton's, nevertheless stood himself up as the guardian of an older Victorian traditional America. And so all we knew was how deeply they hated and loathed each other. And when I was writing my chapter on the 1990s, I came across the fact that their loathing of each other, which was real, did not prevent them from working together very closely on the Telecommunications Reform Act of 1995. What this act did was to lay the groundwork for internet growth, availability, and corporate consolidation. And the act made clear that this was such an extraordinary technology that could go in so many different directions that any effort to regulate it was bound to fail. And so it was approved both by Democrats and Republicans as a technology that would be allowed to be free in a way and to allow the entrepreneurs, the venture capitalists, the corporations, the brilliant minds who were pushing this new form of technology into existence to follow their instincts. There was no effort to raise difficult questions about whether this medium perhaps might need to be regulated. And that was all the more surprising because this country had a very rich tradition of public media, certain public media that were thought to be so essential to the health and vigor of democracy that certain regulations had to be laid down about what you could say and what you couldn't say. Many of you probably have not heard, although you're in a journalism school, so maybe you've had about the fairness doctrine that was in play from the 1940s through the 1980s. If you were a broadcaster and you put a certain political point of view on your broadcast, you were obligated to give equal time to your opponent. Is that fairness doctrine was abandoned by Ronald Reagan in the late 80s, and it was not revived by Clinton in the 1990s. Obama may have had an opportunity to revive it, saw no interest in it. There was consolidation around the need to free media from all regulation. Rush Limbaugh, the first great shock jock of the modern era, used to call the abolition of the Fairness Doctrine his ticket to freedom and fame. That's how important it was, and that's how it set the stage for a radically different form of media. In telling this story, I looked hard, very hard, for critics of the Telecommunications Act of 1995. I looked in the Democratic Party, where you would expect to find supporters of regulation. Didn't find them. I looked at journalists, didn't find them. I looked in think tanks, didn't find them. I found one lonely columnist writing for Newsday, a man by the name of Marvin Kittman, who was the only voice at this moment of extraordinary transformation, who was raising the questions that needed to be raised. If this was not to be regulated, what about if vile stuff across the internet? What about if algorithms promoted hate? What about if the 100 flowers bloom approach to technology left us 10 or 15 years later with 5 or 3 major media companies controlling the entire output of technological and social media in the United States? He was asking these questions, and he became my hero. But he was the only one asking those questions. And as you look at the 1990s, you have to ask, why were not more people asking these questions at the time, given what transpired? There were some good reasons for not asking questions. There was a utopianism surrounding this technology, which is hard for those of you who are students today to recreate. I don't know what you think about AI, but you probably don't think it's going to lead to a utopian universe. In the 1990s, everyone thought that this technology was so extraordinary and was promised so many things that it could achieve a kind of perfection. And everyone would have a voice. There would be thousands of media outlets. Everybody's voice was equal. It was a marvelous moment of democratic enthusiasm. But it became a story of democratic enthusiasm getting too exuberant and leading people astray. So the 1990s is a story of a debate that should have happened and did not happen. And the one presidential administration that has sought to impose a regulation on the social media companies and the tech lords that really breaks from the traditions of the Republican and Democratic parties, because Clinton is implicated in this, George W. Bush is implicated in this, Obama is implicated in this, Trump is implicated in this. The one presidential administration that tried to break with this pattern and to impose serious regulation on the tech companies, perhaps in an effort to curb polarization and do other things, was the Biden administration. And if you want to know why so many key figures in Silicon Valley, who had been Democrats their entire adult lives, who had voted only for Democrats, if you want to understand why they all were sitting on the dais at the inauguration of Trump and went to Mar-a-Lago to bend a knee, what it reveals to us is the magnitude of the power struggle that was going on all around us. A power struggle that in the short term, the tech lords think they have won. In order for us to have a healthy democratic future, we are going to have to return to Marvin Kittman and give him some help and have a discourse about means of communication in this country. What is freedom? What is tyranny in media? How do we use these extraordinary tools to improve rather than undermine democracy? My final comment is, when you think about the media, when you think about journalism, and you may already be doing this, think not simply about culture, think not simply about stories, think about power. Who has it and who doesn't? Media companies, newspapers are powerful companies with very vested interests. And the story of the 1990s is a story of economic interests driving a coalition that was thriving underneath the apparent cultural polarization of the moment. And as we look today, I want to ask you not simply to focus on the culture wars, but to look at the political economy that lies beneath. Because if we don't look at that political economy, we are going to have an incomplete picture of how to forge a better future. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Gary. That to me, when I was reading your book, that insight about as a young journalist starting out in the 90s, that was the obsession, the culture wars, right? We were covering that. It was so there in front of us. And then to be seeing what we were missing. And so I think we'll get into that more today, what we might be missing right now, because there's so many things right in front of us right now. It almost makes the 90s look like a slow news day. But that period of Gingrich versus Clinton and the impeachment and other things, there were so many shiny objects that we were focused on. And yet this bargain was happening behind the scenes that was going to reshape the world and the economy and the politics of the world in ways we're still dealing with right now. Okay, now we'll move to Sarah. Over a decade ago, you and Jeff Berry documented the way that shifting media landscapes spawned an entire genre of political media driven by outrage-based content that nurtured political polarizations. For example, Rush Limbaugh, Glenn Beck, Lawrence O'Donnell. I'm hoping you can give us a similar insight into the current media landscape. How have things evolved, and what should we be noticing?
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It's lovely to be here, and it was a pleasure to sit in the first panel as well and to learn and hear from the students and everybody. So thank you for having this wonderful event. And yes, the outrage industry, one of the key things that we showed in that book was the way that there had been an assumption that sort of increased polarization in the US was driving this sort of development of these different political media hosts that were giving us the far right and far left content that was so extreme. And one of the things we show in that book is the way actually shifting media arrangements that made it economically profitable for the first time to draw in tiny niche audiences, to offend large groups of people and not worry about it, are part of significant, it sort of outpaced the actual polarization that was in place at that time. And the fairness doctrine was one of the major contributors to that. So thinking about this question and thinking about what are the things that are moving around in our media landscape that might be shaping polarization today, if I wanted to understand polarization today, the things that I look at and that stand out to me, especially affective political polarization, not just having different views, but really disliking and distrusting the people on the other side. The thing that I would unpack the most and the thing that captures my attention over and over again is short form video. And I mean, TikTok in particular probably takes up more space in my brain technically than it should compared to, all of the range of options, but it is a little special, but also Instagram Reels, YouTube Shorts, etc. So here are the things that get my attention about short form video, just briefly. One is that reporting and academic work on short form video focuses on informational content mostly. A lot of work on disinformation in particular, conspiracy theories, right? Whether these are promoted, how they circulate in the news environment. This is very important. But the thing that I think needs more attention is that content creators don't just inform their audiences, they soothe them, they uplift them, they entertain them. And when I say them, I mean us. So we may feel more informed for having viewed, our short form content when we're scrolling because they often incorporate facts, or facts as the case may be. But those facts tend to be ideologically selective, and they're chosen to reassure the viewer that their anger, their disgust, their indignation, their fear is justified. And so there is, of course, neutral political content out there as well, but creators that are seeking clout or to monetize their content are incentivized to produce sort of feel good or feel bad, as the case may be, content in their quest for engagement, right, for stickiness. And one way they do this is by telling us that the other team is inept, dangerous, deceitful, malfeasant, not just wrong, but actually out to harm us. So I would say one thing in terms of content, if we want to understand polarization, I think we need to take the emotional landscape of those spaces much more seriously. So information, yes, the accuracy is important, but also to think about the emotional experience of viewing and consuming that content and creating that content, because the choices and the incentives that are there are shaping our experience, right? And this is in many ways consistent with what we found about outrage. What has always been there is this sort of political content that's intended to provoke an emotional response for the audience, whether the goal being to get money, political support, ratings, views, etc. 15 years ago. But what's different is the way short form video is distributed, I think, is something quite different from those models, and that interests me. So fans of polarizing content that we studied, oh, and Dean, when you said that journalists didn't know they were going to win, because we were interviewing the fans of this content, I knew that Trump was going to win for sure. From listening to what was so appealing and validating, as I know I mentioned, one person described it as like going to political church, you know, that you feel you go in, and you have your values rearticulated back to you in this way that's incredibly compelling and way sharper and smarter, like Aaron Sorkin's writing, right? Like it comes out in this way that you're like, yeah, I should have said that. Anyway, so fans of the polarizing content that we studied had to seek it out, right? They had to go find it. Even today, if you want to watch Hannity or Lawrence O'Donnell, you have to either be in front of the TV at the right time, set your DVR, I don't know if any of you have heard of those, or search for it on Hulu. You have to go look for it, right? But short form platforms, of course, are delivering to us personalized outrage via user feeds and For You pages that are endlessly generating new offerings. And users don't need to go looking for it, it's pushed to you. And so not only do we not need to go looking for it, we don't even have to realize that that might feel or sound good or be engaging for us, because the algorithm knows the immense amount of data collected on us, and by people like us in our habits, in our demographic variables, right? They know what will feel good to us in that moment. So it's pushed toward us in a way that is different from the outrage content of the past. And what's more, and this is why TikTok does take so much real estate in my thinking, is that those uncannily nuanced and adaptive algorithms, the recommendation system, especially for TikTok, is so responsive and quick to adapt to what you're feeling that day, what you were thinking about yesterday. I mean, those of you who use it know it's creepy, for lack of a better word. But at any rate, that means that the short form polarizing content that we're delivered is delivered for us in a way that the niche programming we were talking about in the outrage industry book, it makes that look ridiculous because that was just meant for lefties or righties. And this is going to be for, if you are someone concerned about trans rights in North Carolina, it is going to be about the bathroom bill in your neighborhood down the street, right? So it's going to be very different than your peers. Yeah. So there's been a fair amount of research on algorithmic radicalization to extremism. You might remember there was a lot of talk about YouTube radicalization around maybe 2015, 2016. And there's been some research on algorithmic news selection and polarization, but I think we'd benefit from more empirical work on algorithmic polarization in short form video in light of this adaptive, very hyper personalization, the point of which is to hit close to home. The last thing I'll talk about is the way the consumption context is different. And this is, again, why I think short form video is worth our attention if we're focused on polarization. You know, when we were doing that research, the fans of those shows told us that part of what they loved about their favorite hosts is they felt like they were relatable, which seems funny in contrast, but they felt like they were more like them than a Walter Cronkite or like a sort of stately news anchor. And they also sometimes felt like they were talking right to them. Well, short form video obviously has taken that and dialed it way up. There is no more desk, there aren't graphics, right? The content is generated often by regular people who are just like us. And the production norms mean that they often are holding the phone very close to their face. They might be in their living room, in their bed, dressed informally, if not in their pajamas, right? So it literally feels as though you're talking to a friend. And so what we used to think of, or that concept of a parasocial relationship, is even more intimate, where you feel like you really know this person and hence can trust them. And so I think that's really important. It feels akin to friendships, and in some way they are more akin to friendships, thanks to commenting features, live stream interactivity, those types of things. And in an information landscape, of course, where people assess the quality or the value of the information they get based on who gave it to them rather than how it was produced, this matters. So there are other aspects of the consumption context that make increased attention to short form video important for polarization. Just mentioning quickly, one, the affordances. One I think about a lot that I'd love to see research on is the role of autoplay. I can't decide, but I think it's pretty interesting that with TikTok in particular, because it does not have autoplay, it just keeps repeating for those of you who don't use it. You have to stay engaged. You have to be there to keep watching, to decide what to skip or what to view. And I think that command of your attention in a multi-screen environment is pretty important and seems pretty interesting to me. On the other hand, when autoplay is present, maybe you skip fewer, maybe you do take your hands off the phone, and so maybe it broadens the amount of content, the kinds of content you see. I'm not sure, but either way, I'd be curious about that. I'm also interested in the way hyper-personalization individualizes and obscures consumption. The algorithm is so specific that we don't know what our partners or even our best friends, right? Our children, our parents, depending, both, what they're seeing. So they can be right next to us and you can have a lot of overlap in what you're seeing, but we don't know what they're consuming. So whereas we might have had a TV show before that used to be watched and talked about, there's less room, I think, for critical questions, for fact checking, for like, oh, that's not true. Just this morning, my son, when he should have been doing something else, sent me an Instagram reel that it was about Congress and all the crimes they've committed. It took me roughly 3 seconds to send him the fact check that was in fact not true. But I wouldn't have known he saw that and believed it unless he had, if he hadn't sent it to me. So at any rate. So I think the sort of privacy in the way we consume is really significant, and the fact that we're consuming different things from a polarization perspective. So last thing I'll mention quickly is the emotional and affective context of consumption I'm interested in too. My early work early in this project I'm doing now with young folks and the way they use their phones, my sense is that a lot of the short form video consumption is happening in times that I don't want to overstate it, but where maybe you are a little vulnerable, you're feeling a little lonely, you're maybe a little bored, it's before you go to bed or when you wake up in the morning. And that intimacy and that sort of state of mind, the emotional experience, not only of the creator, but of the consumer, I think that's interesting in terms of polarization and how we might be connecting with the content that we see. So I will stop there, other than to say that, of course, there are other players in the information landscape that are important and relevant to polarization: podcasters, streamers, social media platforms like Truth Social, news influencers, and the other important part of the context, of course, are the changes in our relationship to conventional news production, like the ideologically patterned distrust of news media, distributed discovery, which some of you probably talk about in your classes, budgetary constraints that came up earlier, and eroding access to key political figures, like we saw this week with the White House Correspondents Association's struggle over the press pool. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Sarah. So we're going to get into the Zelensky meeting in the Oval Office because I have 3 specific questions for each of you that I think will help frame where we are. But first, before we do that, we started in the 80s, we went to the 90s, the early 2000s. I want to just briefly with Dean take things back a bit more to the 1860s, okay?
I'm not that old, but go ahead.
So I watched too many historical documentaries, and the other night I was watching yet another Lincoln documentary. The AI and the Chinese may get into and compete with us on many things, but they'll never match us in our production of Lincoln biographies and documentaries. But on this one, there was a historian who was talking about Lincoln, and he compared him to a very famous tightrope walker in the 1850s. Who walked across Niagara Falls. He was a famous guy. And he mentioned how, and I find myself thinking about you, So,
But again,
bear with me. He mentioned that the tightrope walker realized he needed to push ahead, but he had to stay dead center on that rope or he'd go down into the rapids. And Lincoln was the same way. Lincoln said, again, when people talk about historical times, a comp about where we were is often people say we haven't been this polarized since the 1860s, right? Since the Civil War. And Lincoln famously said something to the effect of, in a highly inflamed time, the worst thing I can do is inflame things more. And Lincoln needed to push ahead, but he also realized he could very easily fall into the rapids if he pushed too far and if he strayed from the center. If Lincoln had told the public how he really felt about abolition, we would have had a slave endorser in the White House. He barely won, right, in 1860. Your job, of course, is not political when you're running the New York Times, but it has enormous influence and it has political dimensions to it, right? And I'm just thinking about some of the things. You, on your watch, the first Trump election, immigration, Me Too, George Floyd, trans medical care, Black Lives Matter, January 6th. These are all completely, and that's just a partial list of the things you had to deal with. You also had to deal with a staff sometimes who wanted you to go more to one side or the other, and a public that wanted you to go one side or the other. Did you ever feel like a tightrope walker?
I did, as soon as you said it, by the way, I got the analogy. First, I want to say one thing about the two of them. It's a reminder why journalists write the first draft of history, and actually in both analyses, you just realize the need for people to pull back and put things in a long historical context. I mean, I learned a lot listening to to both of you. Yeah, I mean, not all journalism institutions, by the way. As I said earlier, the world of journalism is large. There's always been a National Review. There's always been a Nation. But the role of the New York Times or the Boston Globe or the Washington Post in the landscape is to try to figure out how best, and it's difficult, how best to cover difficult stories while, on the one hand, being tough enough to call it out. I mean, we were the first ones to, and I can remember the debate. We were the first ones to use the word lie in reference to Trump. And just to carry that on, it was the perfect moment. But I wasn't anxious about using the word that one time it was right. I was anxious about opening up the floodgates for the word lie to appear, every time the mayor of Dayton, Ohio said his budget was 50 million and it was 55 million, right? It was a really difficult discussion. And that whole era you're talking about was very difficult. My way of managing it, frankly, was to always lean on reporting, was to always lean on a little bit of empathy too, for the staff as well as the participants in a story. But it was quite tricky. I'm not one of those who, I don't use the word objectivity anymore because it's gotten so fraught. But I do believe that most subjects are really complicated. And that most subjects, not all, not anti-Semitism, not racism, but that most subjects are really complicated and actually have multiple sides. I mean, I think most subjects that are in debate in America are really complicated. And I think the job of journalism is sometimes to just surface those complications and to make sure people understand just the complexity of some of these discussions.
And just one quick follow-up on that. You now, as I mentioned in the first panel, the Times has 11 million subscribers, the most in the English-speaking world for a news publisher. But something important has changed over that time, that there is much more of a center-left readership than it was when it was in the print era.
I don't know, actually, I'm not 100% sure that's true. I mean, I think, remember, at the height of the print era, the New York Times' biggest circulation area was New York City. And its second biggest circulation area was San Francisco and then Washington. So I suspect that's always been, it's more pronounced now because, 11 million is a lot bigger than 1 million and they have more of a voice.
Right. You also had the New York Times News Service that went out to
That's right. That's right.
millions more than that at its height.
Yeah.
That went into every news publication, or most of them around the country, that was influencing that. So
Yeah.
you could only move so far, and some of those.
You also had
issues-
a newspaper economy, frankly, where you didn't depend on readers.
Yeah.
Which was even more, right? I mean,
Right.
80 to 90% of your revenue came from advertisers. So most newspapers didn't think a whole lot about readers. We were a monopoly. They came whether they liked us or not. So the whole relationship with readers has been transformed. Frankly, I'll say, I think for the better.
Mhm.
I also think journalism is better today than it was, even though there's less of it. I think it's better today than it was 20, 30 years ago, significantly better.
So that idea of independence, we've talked about being independent from the government, independent from the businesses you're covering, but independence, what does that look like in your chair when you're running the Times, to be independent from your own readers and their
Yeah.
desires?
The greatest, if you go back and read great journalism over time, I always thought the greatest act of courageous journalism was, do people know who Gene Patterson was? Probably not. So Gene Patterson was, when he died, his last job was as editor of what was then called the St. Pete Times. But at his height, he was the editor of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution at the height of the Civil Rights era. And he would write front page editorials, like after the church bombing, essentially criticizing his readers. I do think that independence from readers is important. I do think that if you're going to, sometimes you have to say things to your readers that they don't necessarily want to hear. I used as an example, our readers did not want to hear that maybe Joe Biden's age had affected him. And I think that was, there are times when you just have to be independent of readers too.
All right, let's get to the Zelensky meeting last week, because I think a number of people who watched that with their jaw in their laps were trying to figure out what to make sense of it. And I have three specific questions that I think play into each of your expertise, because this is a big moment for anyone who lived during the Cold War at any point, this idea for that. So Dean, you mentioned about lie and your worry about that. I'm just interested in your thoughts on how to cover a moment like that when we've heard so many times unprecedented and historic and never be seen before in the first Trump administration, which was just a wind machine of norm shattering, right? That happened. But here was something that is unimaginable in 75 years of the post-war world, to have that unfolding there at the end of that. How do you think the press covered it? How should they have covered it? And is it possible to capture historic moments anymore when those terms have already been used so much?
I actually thought and I'm going to use the Times and the Post, because as I was sitting there, I mean, one of the downsides of not being editor of the New York Times anymore is you can't shoot emails to everybody with all your ideas, because sometimes they don't pay attention. But in reading the coverage of the Post and the Times, I thought they did a really good job. I thought, first off, you could, if you read the live feed, I mean, it's the elegance of modern journalism is that you can actually watch a story really unfold. The live feed could have had as its headline, "Holy shit," which is sort of news in the moment. But I thought there were stories by Peter Baker and others that pulled back and said, we have tried to explain to you this remarkable and historic pivot to Russia. This is what's going on here. I thought it was I thought the coverage was pretty good, actually.
Okay. Gary, you talked about your students and how hard it is to convey what it was like during the Cold War, what the ambitions of the Soviet Union really were, and how that played out into the global scene. What did you make of watching this, and how would you convey this to a younger audience who didn't live through that?
Well, I thought the moment was appalling and unprecedented, and I would try and convey that to students. I think if I take a step back, the context that I'm looking for is that the era of Pax Americana, of America imposing its peace on the world, is ending. That's the period of time in the 1990s, really up until about 2020 or 2022. The world is in throes of reorganizing itself. And Trump is one of those who imagines the world being run by and dominated by four major hegemons, Russia being one, United States being two, EU perhaps being three, China being four, maybe one other country, Brazil or India. For the world to transition to this new place is extremely difficult and extremely perilous because no one is sure any longer of where the boundaries lie. And I don't mean simply physical boundaries, but what can they say that will achieve their aims without overstepping too far. I think the Putin story is someone who was uncertain of the boundaries and he overstepped too far and ended up in a disastrous war in Ukraine. So if we think of this objectively, we can see that there's no easy way to move from a world in which America is dominant to a world in which it's one of three or four players. That's got to be a tricky, bumpy ride. What I found, I'm not surprised by Trump siding with Russia and celebrating Putin. He did not refer to what is Putin's humiliating moment because Trump always brings stories of strife back to himself and his own ordeal. He was imagining that the first impeachment of Trump, which involved Ukraine, of course, was as hard for Putin as it was for Donald. It was a pretty extraordinary moment, but if we understand his narcissism, not really surprising. The true crucial moment for Putin is the collapse of the Soviet Union and the dissembling of the Russian Empire. I think there's no precedent in world history for an empire that is declining but still very powerful to voluntarily dissemble itself and give its power and resources away. Putin regards what Gorbachev did as the most humiliating moment in all of Russian history. And he's going to be the second coming of Peter the Great to restore Russia to its older greatness. That moment motivates him. And in talking to students, that would be a moment that I would stress. What is most striking about that episode, and we still don't know enough about it, and this is where the reporters have to do more digging, to what extent was Zelensky ambushed? To what extent was he unprepared for what was coming? Did he make missteps? I don't think we've got enough. This is where the reporting has to kick in, and I'm sure it will kick in. We don't know enough about that. But for Trump to treat someone who had been an ally of the U.S. So humiliatingly, and it was not just Ukraine being treated in this way, but all of Europe and the European alliance being treated this way. That, in terms of diplomacy, as far as I can see, going all the way back to Lincoln and before him, has no precedent in the Oval Office. And I would try and convey what is most surprising, the poor treatment of friends and allies as being the most catastrophic element of that moment, and the squandering of soft power. I don't really understand. I understand his desire to take Greenland. I get. We can talk about that later. But the squandering of the prestige of America, the soft power of America in the world, the wanton squandering of that is something that I think has no precedent by a president in American history.
Can I ask an unfair question? I'm curious whether you think Trump is aware of the historic shifts he's sitting in the middle of? Or do you think that, I guess I'm asking, is he aware of it and has decided that it's an acknowledgement of the way power has evolved at this point? Or do you have a view of that? That's an unfair question because I'm asking to get into his head, but I'm curious.
Well, I've been in his head recently, so I can, I could tell you what the journey is like.
You okay?
Interesting. It's not an unfair question. It's an urgent question. I think he is aware of this being a moment of inflection in world history. I think he is aware that the U.S., for a variety of reasons, has to give up some of its international commitments. It's also true that the agents of change are often not very pleasant people. And I say this not simply in regard to presidents, but I say this in regard to free speech advocates, that some of the people around whom the critical free speech cases in our history were not very pleasant people. And in fact, they were horrible, often obnoxious people. And it's precisely these messengers who sometimes need to knock things around to move the world too comfortable in the old to a place in the new. But what's missing from Trump is what I would consider to be what would a sophisticated approach to a multilateralism of four hegemons look like, right? How do we get from where we are now to where we need to be? And that I think he has no conception of, and the notion that everyone in the world is going to bow to him is a deep illusion. And there's all these stories about the Kremlin laughing and just being so delighted at what's going on. But the real story is what is going on in China as Trump is squandering his essential alliances.
I just want to bring Sarah in on this. There was a very telling moment where President Trump said, "This is great television," right? And I was thinking about Marshall McLuhan and the message is the medium. And we, of course, have had presidential administrations that have been built for television. Ronald Reagan had Mike Deaver, whose whole job it was is to stage manage pictures for the nightly news. But that was always in service of a bigger policy agenda. We'll own the news cycle in service of this. Sometimes with President Trump, you get the sense that it's the moment of the media moment and the confrontation, and there's not that much beyond that. Do you have a sense of from that, in particular with your study of how this then gets refracted into these mediated guides to how you see the world in these churches that people join? Is this working really well for that church coverage?
Yeah, so the thing that's funny, if anything's funny about that moment, is that it works for both sides, right? So it's ideological gold for the people who want to take him down, right? So it's wonderful to use generative AI to take apart that scene and create new images and new video content that can be used as a form of mockery and derision. And it's also gratifying for folks who want to celebrate it and say, it's like open text. It's like Archie Bunker. You can laugh at him or you can laugh with him. And so it functions perfectly to have that media moment for the group of content creators and folks who want to comment, and all the way up to SNL, did their cold open on that on that meeting. But the fact that through his lens as the president, he thinks that's going to make for great television is unsurprising given what we know and what we've seen in the past. But it's also, it's funny that you picked that just because I put that on Blue Sky because it was so striking to me, and it felt so irresponsible in the context of the significance of what happened in that moment and the gravity for the Ukrainian people. And so in general, just that those disconnects feel so far removed from what normal, and when I say normal, I mean in the sociological sense, the norms of politics would have been not that long ago, right? Where people in politics would be criticized if they rolled their eyes or made a loud sigh or interrupted someone. And here we have a president who's saying, oh, that's good television.
This is the bed of nails theory, that any one of those things could have been disqualifying, but when you have a whole, you just rise on that. I want to move to just a question about language, because we're talking about polarization. And you know, there's this website, Tangle, that you might be familiar with, where there's a journalist who's trying to take a big issue of the day and then see it, how the right is seeing it, how the left is seeing it, and here's my take of it. He spends an enormous amount of time about language, just how to refer to certain things, because he found and pulled out some data, some interesting data and surveys that they've done with their own readers, that you lose people with just certain words and phrases, and immigration is a perfect example of it. Undocumented, you lose a lot of people who think immigration is, people are breaking the law and immigration is lost. Illegal, you lose some people who think that that's dehumanizing. So they call people unauthorized immigrants. But it's very interesting to me that the word and the phrasing and the choices that they talk about, they're very conscious of that. And that might be pushing something through, like that might be harder in the New York Times than it certainly is in a small website. But should we be talking more about this? You know, Dean, you just said certain things are clear, anti-Semitism and racism. But one of the interesting things, Sarah, I was thinking about in your research was the fear of being called a racist was a big driving force into people going into the arms of more extremist, outrage-fueled voices, because they felt affirmed and safe to be able to not walking on eggshells around that. So I'm just wondering how, you know, Dean, what you think about those language choices, and whether in your work, Sarah, you've seen that we should be paying more attention to that. And the last thing for Gary, for you, is immigration. David Leonhardt in the Times had a really interesting magazine piece just a few days ago about the one progressive government in Europe that's managed to build on its power rather than being in retrenchment mode, and that's in Denmark. And they made a strategic decision to be tougher on immigration with more immigration regulation. And his point was, in this country, we haven't had a real issue about immigration, a real debate, because the Democrats picked one side and the Republicans picked another. And it's a complicated issue, as you said. So
I thought that piece, by the way, was also about something larger too, which was, you know, I mean, I thought he really surfaced the complexity of the issue. I mean, he surfaced the fact that the history, the era when during this, there were periods during the civil rights movement where civil rights leaders were opposed to immigration because they feared they would take jobs away from Black people. And I think Steve Bannon got that, and he actually says that. That's one of his mantras. I thought that story was, you know, if you want to sort of grapple with complexity, I thought that story did it. Language, I mean, I found those discussions when I was running the Times among the most frustrating, because I'm surprised that unauthorized, that people were okay with that. I think in the end, I always try to use my view was you should just be descriptive. Obviously, you can't always do that, but whenever possible, you should just be descriptive and not fall on words. I mean, we did use the word racist a couple times in reference to Trump's language. I do think that you got to be, and it was clear, and it was, you know, I was very comfortable with it. I think you do have to be measured in a daily news report. And the only reason I think you have to be measured, without bullshitting people, I'm not, if he lies, he lies. But I do think that if not not for business reasons, because you're turning off readers or anything. I just think that you have to have some kind of comedy so that PC, not COMEDY, so that people can actually just read the stories and think about the stories and draw their own conclusions. I always thought one of the best pieces I ever read about racism was this wonderful piece when Joseph Lelyveld, who was the editor of the New York Times long before me and who hired me and was a mentor and friend, was sent to Philadelphia, Mississippi to do a profile of the city of Philadelphia. He never uses the word racist. Boy, but if you read that story, it's clear that everybody he meets is a racist because he describes what they say. He describes, the guy who, there's a guy near the top of the story who says, we all get along here. And when he looks at a black guy who's walking down the street, he says, isn't that right, boy? Did he even need to say that guy was racist? I don't think so. But it is like a powerful indictment of that town. And to me, that's language at its best. It's sort of, it's observation and scene. And if you don't get it, then it's just obviously you're going to get it.
And journalists in the crowd, students, what is that an example of? Showing, not telling. Right, yeah, exactly. Sarah?
That's great. One thing I'll say, thinking about language outside of the journalism context, but very much in the polarization context, is that it's incredibly sensitive and it causes a lot of problems. So one thing that I really watched happen through the outrage industry research and in the election of Donald Trump for the first time was the way language was politicized and used created this giant rift across. And on the right, there was the belief that all efforts to be what was then called politically correct, right, were disingenuous, and a lack of recognition. I think that it was often as though political correctness itself was the problem in the way things were presented in the speeches on the right, and a lack of awareness that very often these efforts are genuine, well-intended efforts to be respectful and honor other people. On the left, there's a phenomenon of using word choice as a proxy for moral character that is pretty divisive as well and leads to a breakdown in communication because it's really easy to say that's problematic or that's racist or whatnot. And you can and choose, and there are right times to say that, but it's also going to end the conversation immediately. So I think those riffs around language and the moments that that's happened on the left, your left, my left, on the left, created a space in which the folks on the right then felt very under threat and scared and judged and looked down upon, and then created an environment where political correctness was the problem. And I think so it's actually, I don't want to blame the victim by saying you shouldn't be able to say those things. Instead, I'd call attention to the fact that the choice to call people out on word choice rather than broader ideas gets in the way often of discussing the broader ideas. And so I think that conversation about how do we refer to immigrants is who are undocumented is a really great example of that's important to a lot of people, but we also don't want it to get in the way of having the conversation about policy and human rights.
The biggest predictor in 2016 of whether people voted for Donald Trump after party affiliation was whether they answered yes to political correctness has run amok. So that, to your point, it drives people in certain ways. All right, we want students now to get questions. We've got journalists here, lots of great journalists in the crowd, so we want to have time for questions. Professor Wolk and Professor Sylvia will be going around with mics, so let them know if you've got questions. Gary, dealer's choice here, do you want to weigh in on the immigration issue, or do you talk to me about 1924 and an uplifting experience? So I want to make sure we get time for that. Something uplifting for the crowd today.
You want the uplift now or at the end? You want me to speak now briefly?
Yeah, please.
I'll only say about immigration that I don't think I was of the generation that replaced illegal alien with undocumented. Has not made a difference to the conversation. This is a substantive issue. Wherever the right has risen to power in Europe and the United States over the last 10 years, the immigration issue has been among the most important or second most important issue. It's an issue that we, denizens of the New York Times, universities, cosmopolitan cities are not comfortable with because our Unitarianism, I'm not a Unitarian, sorry. Sorry. Our humanitarianism, that goes with Unitarian. Our humanitarianism and our cosmopolitanism inclines us to welcome people, and this country has a rich tradition of welcoming people. But it's a signifier for a much greater battle that's going on, which in part is about the future and the climate, the 50 to 100 million climate refugees that are going to be looking for new homes in 20 to 40 years. The right has a very clear and cruel policy. Build walls to keep the riffraff out, let in only the choicest immigrants, better if they look like us or have the same religion, Unitarianism. The left does not have a clear message on this, and our humanitarianism and our cosmopolitanism do not suffice as an immigration policy. And that's the brilliance of David Leonhardt's piece in the New York Times last weekend, right? I really recommend everyone reading it. And I'm sorry for the we, some of you may not feel this cosmopolitanism and humanitarianism, but many in the university world do. And we have to develop a better policy. It's about substance. It's not about words or language. A hopeful story, just so that you understand that not all culture wars last forever. In fact, no culture war lasts forever. 1924, 101 years ago, the Democratic Party is split between what were called the Northern urban wets, led by Al Smith, wets because they drank a lot and they were opposed to prohibition, and the evangelical white Christians of the South. Al Smith led the North. William McAdoo, Woodrow Wilson's son-in-law, segregationist, probably racist, led the Southern evangelicals. They met in Madison Square Gardens for 10 days. They went 103 ballots over 10 days, neither side being able to win. They finally gave up and nominated a nondescript corporation lawyer from West Virginia named John Davis, who proceeded to get crushed by Calvin Coolidge in the general election.
This is the uplifting story.
I'm getting to the uplifting part. The general sense at the time was the Democratic Party was destroyed and had no future. And who was the man who put Al Smith's name into nomination? Franklin Delano Roosevelt, making his first appearance after his catastrophic encounter with Napoleon. He's looking at this party that he hopes to lead one day, and he thinks he no longer has a party. 1924, 1932, he's elected president of the United States and inaugurates a period of democratic dominance in the United States that lasts for 30 to 40 years. And I say this because I like this story because the sense of divisiveness in 1924 was as great as the sense of divisiveness that envelops us in 2025. And most of us in this room cannot imagine an America in which we get beyond the current culture war. And yet there are examples in American history in the past of Americans moving beyond their culture war and making common cause.
Great. Everyone feel better? Okay.
John W. Davis becomes the lawyer for Steve Kansas against Thurgood Marshall in the case for the Supreme Court.
Wow. Give this man a prize. Right here, Professor Cohen. All right, Rachel.
Hi, my name is Rachel. I'm a senior and I'm studying journalism. And so, Dean, I'm curious, as someone who's been a journalist for decades, do you appreciate the way that social media has now shaped journalism, making the news more minute by minute, or do you see it as more of a nuisance to journalism that is creating misleading information?
Both. Not to be, I mean, when I first became editor, I pushed everybody to get on social media. One of the last things I did as a favor to my successor was to encourage everybody to get off of. social media, because I thought in terms of leading the newsroom, it was a real pain in the ass. Because people couldn't control themselves. They were going on, they were getting in fights, they were revealing their politics. It was just it made the place difficult to manage, and it's calmer now. I'm of a lot of minds about social media. I think social media on the one hand, has been difficult to manage. I think it's brought out some of the anger in society that we're all talking about. It's hard not to say though that having so much access to information, put aside the bad information, is not good for the society in some ways. It's just hard not to, I mean, this is sort of not quite social media. It's just hard not to believe that, as a kid growing up in New Orleans, I would have had all I had access to was the Times-Picayune. That I would have access to so much more stuff, so much more opinion, so much more conversation. Yes, a lot of it awful. But it's hard not to think that there's not some good in that, in the access to that. But it was a pain in the ass to manage in the newsroom.
Willow.
Hi, my name is Willow. I'm a senior studying journalism, and first and foremost, I just want to say thank you all so much for coming. This whole panel and the panel before have just been so incredible and getting a sense of things. Dean, in your last panel, you mentioned a bit about the importance of diversity in the newsroom, whether that's diversity as we think about it in this kind of nebulous term, or just diversity of opinions and backgrounds. I'm kind of curious, thinking along the lines of polarization, as we're seeing, the phrase of DEI become something of a dirty word and something of a taboo framing on one side of that polarized viewpoint. How do we ensure that journalists within the newsroom and people without the newsroom, but outside of the newsroom, are able to kind of still form into those senses of diverse opinion, making sure that we're still being objective by getting as many voices as possible to kind of come in? I lost my question a little on there.
No, that's okay. I got it. I mean, I'll repeat a little bit of what I said earlier. I don't think you can possibly cover a community or the country in all of its ramifications and in all of its differences if you don't field a staff of people that have their own differences. For a manager, that makes life really hard because you have a lot of people who are, but I just don't think you can honestly cover the country unless you have a lot of different views. And I don't mean opinions, by the way. In fact, I sometimes think I said earlier, we oversimplify. You want to make sure you have X number of Trump voters, X number of, Harris voters. That's not what I mean. I just mean you want to make sure you have people who live in the middle of the country, who when they go to the supermarket, hear a different kind of conversation than I hear when I'm in Los Angeles or Greenwich Village, right? I understand that that's not the full force of America. And you want to make sure you have people in the newsroom who see different things. You want to make sure, you have people in the newsroom who have been in the military, who sort of understand it and think differently about it. And to me, that's not just an ideological or argument of justice. That's an argument of, I don't see how you can cover the country. It's like, how can you possibly cover the currents that are coursing through younger America if everybody on the staff is my age, right? My favorite conversation once was with a reporter I hired, and we had I would invite reporters to debate me sometimes. I'm not sure that was always the right thing to do. It wasn't always fun. And at the end of this tense lunch, she said to me, I had opened the door for this kind of conversation. She said to me, "What did you think was going to happen when you hired people like me? Did you think we were going to be just like you, but younger?" My first thought was, sort of. I kind of was hoping that would be the case. But she was right.
Jonah.
I'm Jonah. I'm a senior majoring in history. What do you think of James Carville's term faculty lounge politics, referring to terms that kind of get originated in, as according to him, academic faculty lounges, and then tend to alienate people on the opposite end of that?
Should that come from people who have been in faculty lounges?
Start and then
I've never heard him say that? You mean,
I think some of the two examples that come to mind are Latinx
right,
or something like unhoused person.
right. It's interesting. If you read David, we keep talking about David Leonhardt's, he talks about the Brahmin liberals. You know, I think he's, not having heard what he had to say. I think there's a little bit of truth in that, and then frankly, it gets a little bit to the diversity argument. Sometimes journalists, and I assume the same is true of academics, we all talk to each other all the time. And sometimes we convince each other that the things we think are important and the language you think is important is actually the language and the issues that everybody else thinks are important. And I think what Carville is saying, apart from the specifics of the language, is you better stop talking to each other and coming up with your own language. You better stop talking to each other and coming up with a narrow view of the world, because that's actually not the world you live in.
Yeah, I think, and this goes a little bit to your point, Sarah, about stopping conversations. I remember talking to, there's a doctor who for about 50 years has run a homeless medical care center in Boston. It works with some of the really tough population. And I asked him about this unhoused thing. And he said, I brought it, we have homeless people on our board. And I said to them, should we change? We're hearing from advocates because we get dinged every time we apply for an NIH grant because they say you shouldn't use the word homeless. And he says, it's the name of our organization. And the people on the board who do not have a home said, we're homeless. Changing the name does not make it different from what we are. And a lot of times there is a sense, if we change the words, we're halfway there to making it better. And that seems to be different from how a lot of
It's what he was saying, is we're having the wrong conversation.
Yeah, I think so. River.
Hi, I'm River. I'm a junior majoring in international global studies, history, as well as a minor in journalism. And thank you all for being here. My question is in relation to candidates marketing themselves through social media. Something I found interesting in this past campaign was the way in which Donald Trump prioritized Twitch streamers like Aiden Ross or going on the Joe Rogan Experience, and rather than speaking to journalists in a traditional setting. So I have two questions. The first is this going to possibly turn into a norm of candidates, possibly on both sides of the aisle, relying on streamers and celebrities rather than journalists? And if so, what steps can journalists take to now still get the interview and still get the story with this new competition?
This feels like your wheelhouse.
I would be shocked if it didn't become a norm. It worked out pretty well for him this time, right? Especially when you're talking about like a podcaster like Joe Rogan with that size audience. But I don't know that it'll be either or. I mean, it's a prediction, so it's just conjecture. But I would imagine that a lot of candidates aren't as, opposed to conventional or traditional news organizations as our current president. So I would imagine that most would continue to do both, because the goal is always, right, to reach the ears and eyes of as many people as possible in a favorable light. So I would imagine most people will be doing both.
I'll just mention that Professor Adriana Lacey, who moderated our first panel, is working with some influencers now to get them fluent in basic journalism 101, so that they can then work to amplify some of the news stories in local news organizations, which I think is a really smart approach to doing this. Question?
Hi, my name's Andrew. I'm a junior in anthropology. I was curious what your opinions were on why some subjects get constant attention while others get nearly untouched.
Such as any?
Such as like Myanmar, or like Israel is constantly in the news, but like Myanmar is never talked about.
I think Frank, that's a fair question. And it's something that we in the newsroom revisit often. We would sort of say, why have we had no coverage from here? Why have we had no, look, a lot of what news organizations do is driven by news. Is driven by, and when I say news, like what's happened in the moment, what's explosive. And I don't mean that in a bad way. It's not to chase clicks. It's like It's news is what happens today. I also think that a lot of it's probably more driven than we know about what we think the interests of Americans are and what we think the interests of the American government are. I mean, Israel captures more attention of Americans and the American government than Africa. Sometimes I think we have to recalibrate and we can do a better job and we need to like steer the ship in a little bit of a different direction. But mainly it's that for better or worse, news is actually the stuff that happens that affects the most people in the moment. That's, I hope that doesn't sound weak, but that's the truth. And sometimes editing is to ask yourself the question, why have we, in a weird way, when I was running the national desk, I would sometimes look at like for myself a map of the United States in my mind. Jack, who worked with me, knows, and I would say, I would look at the map, and the map, California would be huge. It would be like one of those New Yorker joke maps. And I would think, my God, why is Indiana so small? We got to get somebody in Indiana. So that's editing. But the reality is news is like what happens in the moment that affects the most people.
It's great. Last question, Bria.
It's a lot of pressure. Hi. Hi, I'm Tabria Brown. I'm a senior majoring in international global studies and journalism. And Sarah said something really interesting to me that's like got my brain kind of spinning. When you said that the point is to hit close to home, it reminded me of the idea that the point of this polarization and kind of the sensory overload of all the information we're getting all the time, and how we know what every politician and what every influential person is thinking all the time, is kind of distracting us and getting us away from the point, like you said earlier. So I'm curious how you all think that how influential people like our politicians have gotten so good in this era of mass media, social media and such, to kind of distract us from maybe their underlying intentions. And are they playing the game, or are they part of the machine in general? How much of this is intentional?
Are we living in the Matrix, Sarah? Do you want to answer?
Have you taken the red pill? Fell on deaf ears, I guess. The Matrix is. You guys seen the Matrix? Good.
Blue pill.
The politics in America has always been great theater. It still is great theater. What Trump said at the end of that disastrous Oval Office meeting, what was resonant about it was that this is a new form of theater for American politics. And this, I have found living in the UK for 10 years, that it's amazing to me how nationally bounded so many media markets still are in terms of, given that we live in this global world. But the theater of American politics grips people all over the world. And it's something that the United States is very good at, and because it's had 200 years of mobilizing supporters to win the great prizes, small and large. And we are in this new world now, and I think it's incumbent on, and politicians are always looking for an edge. And American history is full of people on the outside using a technological innovation that seemed new and that scared the party in power. And so the people who seized on it most effectively were the outsiders. This began with Franklin Roosevelt in the 1930s, where he was lambasted by every major newspaper, including the New York Times. And
he was not responsible.
Can we hold you responsible for that? And his medium became the radio. The Obama campaigns were the first users of social media in a brilliant way. Trump was the first Twitter president. These were all outsiders trying to use their outsider status, not as well funded perhaps, and not as powerful as the party sitting in power. And so you're reaching for leverage or something that's going to give you an edge. So there's a pretty consistent pattern of both parties using a technological edge to put them back in the game. And this is a story about competition And I think this process is never going to is never going to end. And part of what we need to appreciate about Trump is his political brilliance, which manifests it in various ways. Who mentioned that going to his rallies like entering a political church? Did you say that? I mean, his rallies are kind of extraordinary, kind of call and response experience. He's also pioneered new ways of reaching voters that no one else thought existed and hadn't been reached before. So I think those of you who want to see the end of Trump have to take the page from his playbook, and the page from his playbook is what is going to be the new technology that is going to leap the outsiders, currently the Democratic Party and progressives, back into power. And it's going to be up to the younger generation. And I think there's a tone of regret or sadness in your analysis of TikTok. You know, you recognize the world is here, but it's like the world would be better if it wasn't here. But it'll be up to those of you who have embraced TikTok in a way and the newest technological devices to develop the edge that is going to bring the possibility of progressive and democratic victories back, if that's what you believe. So this, I think, this process has history behind it. It's actually one of the most fascinating parts of electoral competition in the US. And let me not say let the games begin, but let the games resume. And think of your own role in this as pioneering a strategy of electoral success that people in power may have overlooked.
And FDR learned about radio from the politician he feared the most, Huey Long, right? Who brought in speakers to his rallies and then broadcasted on the radio and innovated in a way. Did you want to add to that, Sarah?
Yeah, I was just going to add that in the sort of digital media space, even though we see both sides using these spaces, that the right has been much more successful thus far in a number of avenues. So if you look at news influencers, they are disproportionately conservative and male. If you look at Wired, had a really, I thought it was a horrible data visualization because you had to really look at it. It took me a minute to look at it to realize, but they sort of looked at election influencers. So, and they had them in red bubbles on the red side and blue bubbles on the blue side. And the bubbles were the size, you know, relative to one another, the size of their following across platforms, if memory serves. But they weren't relative to one another. So the biggest red had so many more followers, and the biggest red was Elon Musk, by the way. Whereas the larger numbers of followers for the blue influencers was considerably, like on the order of millions, smaller. So I think that there is a lot of variation and both sides are active, but thus far in a number of spaces, it's been the right who's really mastered these more effectively.
Well, thank you all for the questions and
Thank you.
Thank you, Dean, Sarah, and Gary,
Thank you.
for a really wonderful, insightful conversation. We'll get one more, journalism students will get one more experience with Dean tomorrow and the discussion we'll have then. But thank you again for a really insightful night. Thank you.